Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. Hello, Inquirers. I'm very happy to bring you today's episode. It's a great one that covers a whole range of fascinating topics, including the nature of secularism and whether it should be primarily defined as church-state separation or government neutrality in matters of religion, and what neutrality looks like. We talk about a case that made its way from a small town in Quebec all the way to the Supreme Court, what the ruling was, and the ramifications across the country as the British Columbia Humanist Association conducted original research to measure compliance with that ruling and what they did in order to encourage those that were defying it to come into compliance with the law of the land. But before I get to that, I'd like to take a moment and ask you a favor. If you enjoy Podcast for Inquiry and want us to continue bringing you intelligent, nuanced conversations on complex topics every 2 weeks, please tell your friends, your colleagues, your family, and anyone you know that listens to podcasts, and encourage them to subscribe to Podcast for Inquiry and comment, give us a 5-star rating. This really will help us find our audience and grow our audience and get our message of reason, science, compassion, and secular values out into the public square and have those essentially as the ground rules for public debate. And the second thing I would ask is, if you can, please consider supporting our Patreon at patreon.com/podcast4inquiry. It will help defray some of the costs involved with bringing you this great conversations every 2 weeks. And with that, I'll tell you a little bit about my guest. Dr. Teale Phelps Bondaroff is a researcher and community organizer with a PhD in politics and international studies from the University of Cambridge. He serves as the research coordinator for the British Columbia Humanist Association, where he leads a team that studies a wide range of issues relating to the separation of religion and government in Canada. He has published extensively on the issue of legislative prayer, among other topics. In 2022, he was elected as a councillor in the municipality of Saguenay, British Columbia, Canada. And without further ado, I bring you my conversation with Dr. Teale Phelps Bondaroff. Teale Phelps Bondaroff, thank you so much for taking the time and speaking with me on Podcast for Inquiry today.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So I'm speaking with you today in your capacity as the research coordinator for the British Columbia Humanist Association, because you have published, your organization has published a series of reports which are ongoing that I think is going to be of great interest to our listeners. But before we get to the reports, there's a history here that is essential for people to understand. So why don't you take us back a few years to a town called Saguenay in Quebec, and tell me what happened there that kicked all of this off.
Yeah, that's right. And so the BC Humanist Association has been exploring the issue of legislative prayer for many years now. And legislative prayer is, the time when prayer intervenes into our legislative processes. And yeah, the story does go back to 2006. So a resident of Saguenay in Quebec, Alain Simoneau, he raised concerns that his municipality, Saguenay, was opening their meetings with prayer. These were overtly Christian prayers. The mayor was leading the process. He was crossing himself, and members of the council were crossing themselves. And Elaine very reasonably raised the concern that this created a situation where you have one religion over others being promoted, and where you had religion itself being promoted over non-religion. Elaine was non-religious. And so this complaint worked its way through the legal system. It eventually made its way to the Supreme Court. There was a long sort of protracted journey, which I think some of our legal friends and scholars might enjoy diving into, which included la Commission des droits de la personne et des droits des jeunes, which was sort of their human rights tribunal, or their predecessor to the Human Rights Tribunal. The Quebec Human Rights Tribunal explored the case. The Quebec Court of Appeal explored the case. And eventually it made its way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court upheld the tribunal ruling, which called for Saguenay to cease reciting prayer in their municipal council chambers. Now, this is a very short summary of the court case, only because there's a lot of other elements, right? During the court case, the city amended their bylaws. It didn't make it better, but they would start the prayer. They would start the prayer before people came into the council chamber. There was also a concern that was raised by Elaine about religious symbols and installations in the city, and those were not dealt with. There was a Virgin Mary sculpture piece, I believe. That was sort of a separate question that hasn't really been brought up in the courts. The main question here was, can you start a municipal council meeting with a prayer? And the Supreme Court ruled definitively that you cannot. So the ruling was a very strong one. Basically, the Supreme Court, which then this makes this constitutional, says that the state must remain neutral. It must be truly neutral. And this is, one of the sentences there from the court ruling is to ensure that the state is and appears to be open to all points of view, regardless of their spiritual basis. Far from requiring separation, this is talking about separation of religion and government. The quote goes on, true neutrality requires that the state neither favor nor hinder any religion and abstain from taking a position on the subject. Even a religious practice engaged in by the state even if a religious practice engaged in by the state is inclusive, it may nevertheless exclude non-believers. That's paragraph 137 with a bit of my interjections there. Basically saying you can't have prayer at a municipal council meeting. It excludes people. And even if you try to make it ecumenical or as inclusive as possible, it's going to exclude. The state has to appear neutral. This is a democratic imperative. Therefore, don't have prayer at the beginning of your municipal council meetings.
All right. So I think I have to let you know, just for the sake of full disclosure, a different organization that I volunteer for, the Canadian Secular Alliance, we were an intervener in that case at the Supreme Court level, making the argument that, not surprisingly, that prayers before municipal sessions is inappropriate and should not be permitted in Canada. But I want that quotation you gave me from Judge Gascon, one of the author of the judgment. That's fascinating because he's talking about true government neutrality in matters of religion. Now, that is what the Centre for Inquiry Canada supports, and that's also what the Canadian Secular Alliance supports. But on a slightly different issue, which is Quebec's Bill 21, which has split the secular community like no other issue in this nation that I'm aware of. And there are genuine secularists, the Movement pour Laïcité of Quebec, the MLQ, which was one of the main interveners in the Saguenay case that you're talking about. So definitely a secular organization is very staunchly in favor of Bill 21, which, among many other things, prevents any ostentatious religious symbols by government employees, which includes teachers. And the judge who ultimately ruled in favor of that at the Court of Appeals has said that regardless of intent, the burden of this law falls primarily on Muslim women who wear the hijab as they teach. So my question is, Judge Gascon emphasized the need for government neutrality in matters of religion, but those who call themselves and consider themselves genuine secularists say that actually that secularism implies a church-state separation. And so our third and fourth episodes of Podcast for Inquiry were interviews with someone against and someone very much in favor of Bill 21. And I'm just wondering what your thought is in terms of when you say that you are definitely a secularist, and I believe you. Do you agree with Judge Gascon, who says that it requires state neutrality, or do you favor more the laïcité, what it seems to be the predominant view in Quebec, which is separation of church and state?
Well, this is you're right to touch on this as sort of a fascinating debate within the community and actually sort of transcending the Canadian community across the world. My fundamental position on this is there's a difference between the state endorsing something and someone's personal practices. So when we were exploring legislative prayer, there's a distinction between when the state allocates specific time at a council meeting for prayer, regardless of what that prayer is, than if someone during their discourse wants to mention their religious beliefs. So, for example, I'm a city councillor here in the district of Saanich, and during one of my speeches, this is never going to happen, but during one of my speeches, if I wanted to mention religious background or my own personal beliefs, that's great. That's kind of why we elect people. Their personal beliefs reflect the decisions they make as decision makers. But the difference would be allocating specific time at the beginning of the meeting for prayer or prayers. That would be the concern. So when it comes to things like, overt religious symbols, concerns for me would be things like having a giant cross on the wall of a building, having religious decorations in your legislative chamber, but individual members of the legislature or individual government employees can express their own religious views how they believe.
So it's the difference between saying having a cross on the wall of the school and an individual teacher wearing a cross on his or her as a necklace, even a large one.
Yeah, and sumptuarial regulations is a passion of mine. Going back to grade 11, I guess it was grade 10 and grade 11 science class, when my science teacher, Woody Niebel, would not let me wear a hat in class. And I found that quite ridiculous insofar as we treat people differently based on their clothing. We actually have these really weird regulations at the provincial and federal level as it relates to sumptuarial regulations. Those are regulations as it relates to clothing. So in the Canadian legislature, you cannot wear a hat. But there's an exemption for people for cultural or religious reasons. Now, those can be interpreted incredibly broadly. Now, I haven't seen someone with a colander on their hat in the Canadian legislature, but what is a cultural reason, right? I really like wearing hats. I'm not wearing one right now, but I wear a lot of hats, both figuratively and actually. And in that sense, what is the difference between someone really liking wearing hats and someone wearing hats because they want to cover a bald patch or because their God tells them to, right? And so in that sense, the government shouldn't be telling people how to dress and should allow people to dress how they'd like. And so I think the big issue here is that question of individual versus the state. The state needs to appear and needs to be neutral, but individuals are themselves, they express themselves in any way they'd like. And I think the problem with, say, like, telling someone you shouldn't have your, wear this certain head covering or you shouldn't wear the specific religious piece of clothing or whatever is kind of the bigger problem of trying to tell people what to do when it has, very little impact on other people. So when it comes to coercion, it's all about the state requiring people to do things. So I think it becomes doubly problematic if the state were to say things like, you have to dress, you can't, you have to abandon specific articles of clothing in order to work here, for example. So I would take the position of, to appear neutral, the state must be neutral, and that means not having a position on such matters.
Right. And I guess the argument in favor of Bill 21 is that the endorsement is implicit. So by wearing a kippah or a hijab or a cross, to use the Abrahamic faiths as examples, if a person in a position of authority, such as a teacher or a police officer, wears that symbol, then the endorsement of the government is implicit, whereas your view and mine, to be fair, is that it's a statement of the individual, and the government is neutral. There's whether there is approval implied is, I think, what the debate hinges on. But let's come back to the Supreme Court ruling. So this was in 2015, nearly a decade after the original complaint was lodged, and as you said, it was a strong ruling, saying that municipalities should not start any of their work with a prayer for the reasons that you mentioned, summarizing or quoting rather.
And this was seen as a democratic imperative, right? The idea is making people feel welcome in that space. I will say, just to jump in on that, if you'll permit me. Now I've seen it from both sides, right? As a citizen and now as an elected official, I sit at our regular weekly council meetings or committees of the whole, and you'll see someone who is speaking at the microphone to share their views on a policy, whether it's off-leash dogs in parks or a tree coming down or a new bike lane, whatever the topic is. This may be the only time they speak to a council, right? They're in front of the microphone, they're being live streamed on the internet, they have 3 minutes to share their views. That's very stressful. You see people noticeably shaking. A lot of people will mention that they're nervous. public speaking, I mean, I was an old debate coach. Public speaking is not something that we, a lot of people are comfortable doing, but people are getting up there, they're sharing their passions. The last thing we want is to make it harder for them to do that, which means making people feel less equal, less welcome in that space. But when you have a space that's dedicated to one religion over others, or religion over non-religion, what you're inherently doing is saying other people who don't belong to this in-group are guests in this space. And it makes it even harder for people to participate. And this is why, the Judge Gascon in Saguenay said this is a democratic imperative. It's not just like a nice to have, it's a fundamental to have, and it's critical. There was another aspect I did want to highlight, which was another aspect, which was exploring what does neutrality look like. And when we've been exploring this issue through the BCHA for several years now, I think we've probably, humbly, I can say we've published most extensively on the subject than anyone else in the country. But the question is like, what does neutrality look like? And the example was true neutrality isn't, it has to be abstaining from having a position, right? Because if you endorse religion, one religion over another religion, the opposite of that isn't staying quiet. The opposite of that would be inviting a secular humanist to come give a statement like, there probably isn't a God, let's get back to work.
Right. And anyone who publicly declares that they believe in God face some sort of sanction, like some sort of punishment for doing so. Oh, you're wrong. You can't participate in the bike lane conversation because of your God beliefs.
Well, in a sense, it's both sides of the coin. So, and the BC legislature opens with a prayer. Their daily sessions open with a prayer delivered by an MLA. We can talk about that at length as well. And what's interesting is, where was I going with that one? Oh, yeah. So they open with a prayer, and they asked us to submit prayers as part of the review process. So they were reviewing the process. This is a few years ago, and the BC Humanist Association made a submission. It was like a 111-page report on prayer in the BC legislature. And one of our recommendations was don't have the prayer at all. It's really not possible to do it in a way that's inclusive. But if you are going to do it in a way, if you are going to do it and you insist on doing it, then you have to include a statement that denies the existence or strongly suggests that there's no evidence to support the existence of a God or gods, because that is the opposite of a prayer. The opposite of a prayer is the negation of the existence of a God, or the assertion that there isn't one, or the assertion that evidence does not exist that there is a God, as opposed to remaining silent on the issue. And that often challenges a lot of people. But one of the ways I use to illustrate this to people, like how you feel in this situation, would be, how would you feel, talking to a religious person, you say something like, how would you feel if every daily session of the legislature opened up with the statement, there probably isn't a God, let's work therefore to help the benefit of our community? Or something even more overt. And then they can start to see and conceptualize why this might make other people feel excluded. So
I was going to bring this up later, but I'm going to ask you now. In Saguenay itself, Saguenay at the time had a Catholic mayor. He was not just Christian, he was specifically and quite overtly Catholic. Most of the prayers that opened the Saguenay Municipal Council were explicitly Catholic in nature, although some were more generically Christian. So you're talking about, what does secularism look like? Would state neutrality be served by either like a non-denominational prayer or rotating prayers from different groups? Say if half of the people are half of the prayers go to various forms of Christianity, and you get 4 or 5% that are Muslim prayers, 1 or 2% that are Jewish, Hindus, and then maybe a quarter. Again, we'll go, depending on the demographics of the community, a quarter go to secular humanists or atheists. So would those types of invocations represent state neutrality, or just don't do it and just get on with business?
Yeah, the answer is no, they don't. And Saguenay is quite clear on this. Paragraph 137 says that even if a religious practice engaged in by the state is inclusive, it may nevertheless exclude non-believers. And the idea there is, and my colleague Ian Bushfield, the executive director of the BC Humanists, and I have published extensively on this, explaining how it's not possible to actually do prayer in a way that's representative. And this comes up, okay, we're going to represent all the religions based on the demographics of the province. Okay, first of all, we need a definition of what constitutes a religion. Canada does not have a functioning definition of what constitutes as a religion, so that's a problem. Second of all, which denominations do we pick? Do we do one Christian prayer? There's tens of thousands of different denominations of Christianity. Which one do we pick? Do we pick them all? In that case, you're going to have an overwhelming majority of Christian prayer. What's really interesting is if you look at the Canadian census, they break down different sects of Christianity in a lot of minute detail, but there's like one button for Judaism, and there's like one button for Islam. Now, like, I know there's a vast difference between a Reformed Jew and an Hasidic Jew, but that's not necessarily captured in the way we do this information, we gather this information. And then on top of that, it gets even more complicated, because who do you ask to deliver the prayer? In some religious traditions, you have a very strict hierarchy. It's very obvious. You ask the bishop to come in and deliver the prayer. But in other religious organizations, it's much more horizontally organized. So who do you even ask in the first place? And then on top of that, you have a whole bunch of other issues around, like, can you constrain what they're going to say? What if you're inviting someone to deliver a prayer and they say something that's quite horrible or discriminatory to people in the chamber? And then some religions are physically not capable of delivering a meaningful prayer in the context of a legislative setting, because their prayers can't be delivered in mixed company, or can only be delivered in a sanctified space, or for whatever, host of reasons. And so you're necessarily narrowing the field of people who can be invited to deliver a prayer. But that field is still incredibly large, and it's impossible for the state to adjudicate. As soon as the state decides that the Baptists are going to deliver a prayer, but not the Anabaptists, they're necessarily weighing in on an issue of dogma. And what we've seen time and time again in Supreme Court rulings is that the state is not in a position to rule on issues of dogma. It's not competent, it's not capable, nor would it reflect the principle of state neutrality. Nor, should I say, would people who are religious want the state to be weighing in these things.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah, this is one of those questions where it's like, where do humanists, secularists, atheists, march side by side with people who are religious? When it comes to religious freedom, I don't think anyone who's religious wants the state putting their finger on the scales and saying, this is what transubstantiation is according to the BC government. Like, that would just be wildly inappropriate. And so it's one of those things where it's not possible to do prayer. Now, in this way, it's not possible to have it on a rotating basis. I will say this. There are different models that have been done. They're certainly better than the model where a single religious prayer is delivered at regular meetings, as was the case in Saguenay. One example is Scotland. They have a rotating prayer that reflects the demographics of Scotland. So sometimes it's a religious person delivering a prayer. Sometimes it's a secular humanist delivering an invocation. Sometimes it's someone from Society for British Sign Language giving a statement in sign language. That's certainly better. But what you see when you look at that is groups are still being excluded. It's not possible to include all groups. And then on top of that, you have places like the city of Winnipeg, which decided that it would be okay if they had a rotating prayer where members of council delivered a prayer, and that somehow got them around Saguenay. That is not the case. It does not work that way, because every day is a discrete meeting. And so people are being excluded from that discrete meeting. And on top of that, it's simply not possible to reflect the religious diversity of Winnipeg at a meeting. You would have to have an infinite number of meetings going towards the future to reflect all the religious groups.
Right. So if I'm giving testimony about bike lanes, because that's the topic of the meeting, and there happens to be a Hindu or a Muslim prayer, and I am neither a Hindu or a Muslim, then I'm that makes it very hard for me. Or if it's a Christian prayer and I'm not a Christian, or it's a Jewish prayer and I'm not a Jew.
Exactly. Right. And then the other question, of course, is like, what is the point of these statements? No, the point is typically to add to the gravitas, add to the importance of the meeting, to underscore the importance. We have a lot of pomp and circumstance that surrounds our legislative meetings, and that's often a good thing insofar as it reminds people that what they're doing is making decisions that will change our communities. In legislatures, we have the mace is marched in as a symbol of the monarchy. You have the Speaker of the House here in British Columbia that has a tricorn hat. You have all this different kind of procedure and practices that surround our legislative processes. We can still reinforce the importance of decision-making without excluding people. And in fact, it undermines our confidence we have in these kinds of legislative chambers when they necessarily exclude people and ignore fundamental rulings. What's interesting here, and I know we're jumping around a little bit, is the Saguenay decision addresses municipal council meetings. You cannot have a prayer, regardless of the type of prayer or prayers, in a municipal council meeting in Canada. According to Saguenay, 2015, it's been many years. However, Saguenay did not explicitly touch upon provincial and federal legislatures, which regularly open with a daily prayer. There are two legislatures that don't, but most of them open with a daily prayer. Most of them are overtly religious. Vast majority of them are overtly religious. Almost all of them are Christian in nature. Some of them are the Lord's Prayer. British Columbia is slightly different, along with the Yukon, where the prayers are delivered by individual members of the Legislative Assembly. And so it tends to vary considerably. But we've also studied that here in BC, and we found that those prayers are disproportionately religious, they're disproportionately Christian, and they exclude a significant number of people. And I'm happy to dive into those numbers. But Saguenay didn't touch upon those because of parliamentary privilege. So there's kind of a separation.
So the context of the Saguenay ruling is municipal municipal councils, and there's lots of those in Canada. There are 10 provincial legislatures, 3 territorial ones, and 1 federal one. So that's let's talk about municipal councils now. I want to thank the BCHA, the British Columbia Humanist Association, because what a lot of people did, and I'll count myself among them, is I celebrated the Saguenay ruling. I thought that was great, and I thought it was good. As you noted, I also noted that it was a strong, unequivocal, unambiguous ruling, and okay. The court has ruled, and it's a great victory. And then we moved on, and there were other, there are other causes to champion, other things to raise awareness about, and I got busy with other things. And where I tip my metaphorical hat to you is that you didn't leave it there. And what you did with some colleagues at the BCHA is, you went out and you verified that municipal councils across the country were actually in compliance with the Supreme Court of Canada. And I had just assumed, of course, that was going to happen. And that wasn't quite the case. So you've published a series of reports, and more are on the way. Can you please tell me the nature of your research and, at a high level, what some of your findings were?
Absolutely, yeah, and this is something I think that, and thank you very much for the kudos on that. I think we're all very happy about Saguenay, and then of course the question is, like, do people just not automatically comply with Supreme Court rulings? What was interesting about after Saguenay was you see a lot of municipal organizations. Here we have the BC Union of British Columbia Municipalities, but in Ontario there's a similar organization that all municipalities and said something like, hey, this ruling happened, don't pray in your inaugural meetings. What happened, kind of the story of how we got into this was, I attend regular council meetings, or I was attending regular council meetings in my municipality, given my sort of deep and abiding interest in municipal politics. And the inaugural meeting in 2018 didn't just have one prayer, it had 2. And so the mayor invited a very religious 2 Christian pastors, one that was very overtly religious, and the other one was actually very ecumenical, and one can almost describe as a secular invocation. They delivered prayers at the 2018 inaugural meeting. So I had a conversation with our research team and with our executive director, and we said, well, like, how many municipalities are violating Saguenay? So we went out and we looked at the regular council meetings and the inaugural council meetings of every municipality in British Columbia. It's 162 at the time. Now there's 161. I think Jumbo Glacier got folded in. And what we found in 2018 is, and we looked at the minutes, agendas, and audio recordings of every meeting that was available. And I should rephrase that. We looked at the recordings, the audio recordings, the minutes, the agendas of the inaugural meetings, and then 3 randomly selected regular meetings of that council after Saguenay. And what I mean by inaugural meetings are meetings that occur right after an election, or generally sometime after an election, where the new council is sworn in. These tend to be meetings that have a bit more ceremony added to them. So, for example, they'll have a piper, the mayor will march in with an honor guard, people will take oaths of office, there'll be a judge there. And what we found was these tended to have prayer in them, as opposed to regular meetings that tended not to have prayer in them. When we looked at British Columbia, 2018 was our last, we had an election here in 2022. 2018 was the previous municipal election round. What we found was 23 municipalities had prayers in their inaugural meetings.
23 out of 162, did you say? Yeah.
2. That's right. 0 had them in their regular meetings, which is very reassuring. When we looked at those prayers, all of them were Christian, and 73.9% of them were delivered by men. And so that was kind of a finding that we had in British Columbia. And it's not bad. We've been trying to look at meetings prior to 2018 to see just what the level of prayer was. And we're in the process of gathering that data so we can do the temporal comparison and say, okay, before Saguenay, X percentage of municipalities had prayer.
Yeah, and presumably it went down, but we don't know that for sure yet.
Yeah. We do know it went down.
Okay.
We're just trying to get the final numbers in. Minutes and agendas and audio recordings aren't always available. I should note that we did a lot of work on this. Our amazing volunteers dug into the minutes and agendas, but also specifically the audio recordings, because often prayer is treated as something that's sometimes not included in the minutes or the agenda. In the British Parliament, the public is excluded for prayer. It's seen as a private matter for the legislators to do between themselves. And so we wanted to make sure that we weren't missing prayers because they weren't included in the agenda. What we did then was we had an amazing summer research team, and we looked at every municipality across the country. And what we found was that prayer continues to happen in municipal council meetings, some provinces more than others. So we published a report on Manitoba. Their 2018 inaugural meetings, they had 7 out of 101 municipalities had prayer at those meetings. 5 of those were pastors, a couple of those were staff, and 5 of the 7 were men. In Ontario, in 2018, their inaugural meetings, 156 out of 328 municipalities, over a population of 1,000, had prayer. So that to us was quite significant, and that's 47.6%, which means almost half of the Ontario municipal councils were violating Saguenay in 2018. Now, we sat back and we're like, look, Saguenay happened a few years earlier. Municipal councils are busy. It's entirely possible they just missed the memo. You get a lot of emails. I can definitely attest to this as a new councillor. So maybe they didn't know. So we spent a lot of time at the BCHA doing advocacy around this issue. We published our report. We did podcasts like this one, public speaking events, media work, and we were trying to encourage municipalities to change their policies and their procedures. And we were quite successful, actually. I'm quite pleased with this as well. We did advocacy. We did emails around March 2019. We contacted municipalities that had prayer in January 2020. And we're like, hey, maybe don't do this anymore. The Supreme Court ruling says you shouldn't do it. The response was mixed. So we had some municipalities that didn't give us a response. That happened quite a lot of times. Some of them simply acknowledged receipt. Thanks.
Yeah, we acknowledge receipt of your email. Thank you for your concern, fellow citizen, and we will take it under advisement and give it due consideration.
Yeah, and now some of them took note and with varying degrees of enthusiasm. So a couple of them said that they would not have prayers in the future, trail, spall machine. A couple of them actually took overt action. So both of the Langleys, there's a Langley City and a Langley Township, they passed motions. So Langley Township amended their procedures bylaw to remove prayer from their inaugurals. Langley City received our letter, passed a motion to do that. So we thought that was quite promising. And so what we did was there was another round of elections in 2022. And we thought, okay, well, before the elections came up, we sent out reminders to these 23 municipalities. Hey, you did prayer in the past. Let's not do that again, please. And then right after the election, there's a couple week period where they're organizing the inaugural meeting. Most municipalities are required to release their agendas a couple weeks before the meeting. And so we looked at the agendas for their inaugural meetings. If they included people who were religious, a prayer, invocation, something along those lines, we would reach out to them and say, hey, maybe take that off. And a bunch of them did, which is very reassuring. They actually responded to us. And then some of them didn't and included prayer anyways. And then we had a couple municipalities that worked prayer to their inaugural meetings without us knowing because they weren't on our original list. And so that was kind of an interesting factor. So we went back after that election. We looked at all the municipal council meetings, inaugural meetings again, and we were able to come up with a list of 8, 9, depending on how you look at it, municipal councils that had prayer in their 20.
So is that across, when you say
meetings.
8 or 9, is that in Ontario, in BC, across Canada?
British Columbia. Yes. Apologies. Yeah, that's British Columbia. Good question. We are currently running the numbers for Ontario. We should have those out in our report in the new year. But that was for British Columbia. So we went from 23. I think it was 25 because we missed 2 of them. So 25. And then now we're at around 8, 9. We're just currently looking at refining the data. And the reason why there's some outliers is there's always a few weird cases. The reason we missed 2 in 2018 was that the inaugural meeting doesn't always happen right after the election. So sometimes it's a month later, or a few weeks later. So we missed a couple of those. And then some of them, it's a bit interesting. And I'm happy to dive into the results we found for British Columbia because some of them were kind of outliers and kind of introduced these new trends that we're noticing as it relates to prayer. And sometimes that's a way of circumventing Saguenay, which should be a bit of an eyebrow raising and kind of alarming as a trend that we kind of identified in Ontario.
Okay, so let's actually talk about that. I'm a mayor somewhere, or I'm on the council in some municipality. It doesn't really matter where, and I'm a religious man, as many Canadians are, and it is my faith that inspired me to public service. I'm a good mayor, overall, but kind of like Tommy Douglas, who was a Methodist and inspired by his faith, founder, generally considered the father of Canada's healthcare system in its current form. I'm inspired by my to public service, and it's just in my view inextricable from who I am, what I do, why I do what I do, my motivation to public service, and I feel the need to make that known, and so. I understand that those judges in Ottawa, which is a long way off, may have said something, but I'm the mayor of this town, and I just essentially ignore it. And I don't discriminate against people who are not of my particular faith, whatever it happens to be, but nonetheless, we start our meetings in violation of the Saguenay ruling with a prayer. What happens? Well, first of all, so what? And secondly, what happens? What's the result?
Yeah, good question. And the good question. So basically, at the moment, no one is really watching or paying attention. But now that the BC Humanist Association is on the case, what will happen is you'll get a letter from us. So right now, as I mentioned, we did some advocacy between the elections to alert municipalities to the need to follow Saguenay. But we've had a few municipalities come back and be repeat offenders in this case. One of them is Parksville, which is an example. And so they've received emails from us in the past that said, don't do this, the Saguenay occurred. They'll receive another letter from us, and that will be a bit more firmly worded. And then at which point, if they continue, then there'll be other exploration of potential legal means. And that would be something like a human rights tribunal or a court going through the courts. I'm not a lawyer, so I won't speculate on the exact legal approach, but they are violating the law, they're violating the Constitution, and they need to stop. But a lot of times, like we saw, municipalities don't know. They want their meetings to be inclusive. So I think in the scenario you talked about, like even in that situation, there's a difference between a mayor talking about their own personal faith when commenting on various projects around the community and allocating specific time and inviting religious figures or delivering a prayer themselves as part of the agenda. And that speaks to kind of the earlier comments around Saguenay, where the state needs to appear neutral. When the mayor is, talking about their own personal beliefs around a park and their own personal history, that's slightly different than when they're overtly endorsing a religion. Although what I would say is that, as a leader of the community, it's really important that someone like a mayor thinks about being inclusive as possible. We have, a lot of holidays coming up that are religious in nature, but also don't need to be religious in nature. One of those examples would be something like Remembrance Day. Right? If you have a Remembrance Day ceremony, yes, it seems reasonable to have a wide range of representation from the faith community and a pastor from the local legion, perhaps giving some comments. But it's also important to leave space for people who are not religious in that service, because it's seen as a state-endorsed practice. And similarly with like the winter holidays coming up, right? One of my favorite examples from this work was the city of Terrace. So we emailed City of Terrace. They had a prayer in their inaugural meeting in 2018. And we're like, hey, we noticed you had a prayer. Please don't do that again. They responded with, thank you. We didn't know. We will not do that in the future. And a little while later, they said, should we also take down the nativity scene on the roof of our city hall this time? And we're like, first of all, we didn't know you had one. I don't visit Terrace very often, but yeah, you should definitely take that down. Thanks for following up. And so one of the things we have in like advocacy and research that's a challenge sometimes is causation. Like we'll often have a correlation. Like we can say, we've been doing advocacy on this issue for a few years and we think we've moved the dial a bit in this direction. But here we had the city of Terrace being like, they pointed out to us that we had to follow Saguenay, so we're not putting up a nativity scene and we're stopping our legislative prayer. And we're like, oh, well,
that's always good when,
yeah,
I mean, I've been a secular activist for a number of years, and I met with sort of the lead bureaucrat in charge of reviewing Canada's criminal code. This was a few years ago, and our key recommendation was that we needed to repeal Canada's blasphemy law. It almost certainly was unconstitutional, and sure enough, it was about 18 months later, but Canada's blasphemy law was repealed, which is great. Like, it's a victory. Now, were they going to do it anyway? Maybe. Would it still be on the books if I, and then again, this was the Centre for Inquiry Canada in partnership with Humanist Canada, in partnership with the Canadian Secular Alliance. So it wasn't just one organization. But if these three organizations didn't sit down and explain that it was almost certainly unconstitutional, that it gives moral cover to countries like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan who execute people for blasphemy, if it didn't chill the speech of recent immigrants who are critical of some of the human rights abuses in their own countries because there isn't the type of separation of church and state. So they listened to us and they repealed the law, but were they going to do it anyway? Would it have happened without our efforts? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know to this day. I'm happy with the result and I'll take it as a win, but it must be very gratifying to know that, yes, it is your initiative here that led to these changes in this township in British Columbia.
Absolutely. And as a researcher, it's very satisfying. And as an activist, it's very satisfying. And we had a few other cases like that, like the Langleys, for example. Like the only reason why Langley Township amended their procedure bylaws was because we pointed out to them that they were unconstitutional. So sometimes it's really nice to have that connection. Sometimes you never get that connection. And sometimes, we had some municipalities where in our original research methodology, we were trying to find out if the prayer was changed as a result of Saguenay, or they just phased it out for other reasons. And we really couldn't tell. And we dropped that research question because you really couldn't get inside the mind of a municipal administrator. You were talking about how does the mayor set up an inaugural meeting? Inaugural meetings are often organized by administrators working with the mayor, and they do what they did last time. So it's every 4 years, so it's not like it's a daily occurrence. They pick up the script from last time, they invite the right people, they find a judge, they find a piper, and they get the whole kind of thing organized. And often what they did last time just gets, kind of grandfathered in, if you will. And as a result, they just keep praying. Now, yeah, sometimes there's no overt choice, but hey, should we be doing this? And you can actually see that in some of the results we got. Now, I wanted to point out one of the ones for British Columbia.
Absolutely.
I can bring us back to the data for a second because it's quite fast. Yeah, so we had, I think it was 9 municipalities that had prayer. The reason why I sort of vacillate between 8 and 9 is there's an interesting edge case with the town of Colwood that didn't have a religious figure come deliver a prayer, but they had a high school secular choir come and sing Deo Gratias, which is an overtly Catholic song. So it was kind of strange. And our position on that is basically, it doesn't matter if 1 person or 20 people deliver the prayer, it's still a prayer. If you're inviting a high school choir to do an opening song, super cool, but maybe just don't have them do an overtly religious one. There's literally millions of songs they could sing otherwise. I told that to my high school choir director back in Alberta, and they were shocked to know that there were songs a choir could sing that weren't overtly religious. Right, that's Alberta, 20 years ago. But the other interesting was Vancouver. So Vancouver, you could see they were trying to be ecumenical, right? And by that I mean they didn't include 1 prayer in their 2018 inaugural meeting. They included 5. So the city of Vancouver, and they didn't have a prayer in 2018, so they weren't on our radar, but they included a traditional welcome with drumming from local indigenous leaders. There was 3 speeches by indigenous leaders as well. And then they invited 5 religious representatives up to deliver what can only be described as sort of like a high school project style prayer. Each one delivered 1 sentence, and they kind of went along the row for 13 minutes. And this included a Roman Catholic deacon, a United Church minister, a senior rabbi, a Sikh Granthi, and a representative of the BC Muslim Association. And it was very much like a round robin. Each one delivered content based on their religious background. So the Roman Catholic deacon delivered the Lord's Prayer and talked about walking humbly with the Lord. The United Church minister prayed for justice, mercy, and humility. The senior rabbi quoted the Torah and spoke about prayer in the world, and interestingly, how we need to appreciate plurality of different ways of living. Sikh Granthi talked a bit about the history of their guru and their local temple, and talked about the beauty of cultural diversity. And the representative of the BC Muslims Association, quoted and spoke about the Quran. Now, this seems super ecumenical. It seems like we're going to show diversity by inviting these 5 people up. But the problem was that it's actually what we pointed out is failed ecumenicism. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why this is problematic and actually even more exclusionary to people, especially non-religious and non-believers. So first of all, what we have in a lot of the prayers that we saw in municipal council meetings was Christian hegemony. It's all the prayers in BC were Christian in 2018, sort of different various flavors of Christianity, but they were all overtly Christian. And what we saw here was, okay, you've included a few other people, but it's Abrahamic hegemony. So you've got 2 different Christian sects, you've got a Jew and a Muslim, and so that's 4 out of 5 of the religions represented are Abrahamic. You only have a Sikh, which is the one non-Abrahamic faith tradition that's represented. And this is problematic for a couple of reasons. First of all, it talks about what is, and this is air quotes for those who are listening on the podcast, what is normal and mainstream religion. And the state is then deciding what constitutes normal and mainstream religion worthy of being invited to such a meeting.
So
the state shouldn't be doing
however
that.
many Hindus there may be, however many Wiccans there may be, however many non-believers there may be, in British Columbia or in Vancouver not represented at all there.
Well, not only that, but like why the Roman Catholics and not the Baptists? Why the Baptists and not the Anabaptists? Why the United Church and not the Anglicans or the Presbyterians or any other
Is it
of
a
the
Sufi, a Sunni, or a Shiite
Muslim
representative?
Well, yeah, exactly. Or like a Reform rabbi is going to deliver a much more hip and with it statement than maybe someone from a more traditional background, right? They might give something a bit more deeply ingrained in their faith tradition, right? But on top of that, these aren't even the top 5 religions in Vancouver if you look at demographics.
Really?
So they kind of forgot about the Buddhists and the Hindus. Like it's one of those things where like you do realize there's a huge Buddhist, not huge, but there's a significant Buddhist population in Vancouver, and they just were either not available that day, which I find somewhat shocking, or they just didn't reach out to them. And that kind of speaks to that challenge I spoke about earlier, which is who do you reach out to do these prayers, which is why ecumenicism fails, because you asked this rabbi, not that rabbi, or you asked because the rabbi has an email and the local the BC Muslim Association is an organization, you reach out to them, but you maybe can't find the right Buddhist to reach out to. That's a problem. So you're preferring some religions over others, you're preferring some sects over others, and this is sort of the stronger underscore, which is you're favoring religion over non-religion. You're saying that religion is so important and needs to be supported by the state that not only are we going to invite one person to pray, we're going to invite 5 people to pray for 13 minutes. So that's a significant percentage of the time of the meeting. And that's time that's reinforcing religion over non-religion, which is making the non-religious feel excluded. But I can't really underscore this enough. Like 13 minutes is a really long time to watch like them go person by person delivering religious content. And it comes back to paragraph 92 of Saguenay, which is a prayer, even a non-denominational one, is a religious practice that excludes atheists and agnostics. So you have the more religious, the more ecumenical, interdenominational religious content you include, the more you exclude non-religious, non-believers, atheists, humanists, etc. So that becomes even more problematic. So it's almost as though the city of Vancouver tried to be ecumenical, but ultimately kind of made it worse in that they make non-religious people feel even more excluded from that process.
One of the recommendations you made in your reports, and you were talking about if a municipality would choose that instead of a prayer to replace that time with a moment of silence, and you said that it should not be a moment of silence should not be introduced in such a way as to avoid. It should be introduced. I want to quote it correctly. A moment of silence should be introduced in such a way as to avoid any perception of intent that it be used for prayer, and a secular reflection should not be used to mask religious content. And that kind of leapt out to me because, okay, a moment of silence, if you want to pray silently to yourself because you're of any kind of faith tradition, great. And if you're a secular humanist and you want to just reflect on the work that you're about to do and go over a speech you're going to give in your head, I mean, this is your moment of silence, and do with it as you please. So I want to ask you, how do cities sneak in religious content, and how can a moment of silence be a vehicle for that? And what is, and this is a phrase that you used, what is stealth prayer?
Fantastic. This is a term that we came up with to describe one of the ways that we notice municipalities trying to circumvent Saguenay. Stealth prayer is sort of a broader category, but the example of stealth prayer that you already mentioned was moments of silence. So what we saw was 3 municipalities. Let me get my numbers on this one here for you here. 3 municipalities had moments of silence, 3 of them in 2022 in British Columbia. But what we found was actually all 3 of those were in memoriam. So a member of council or a staff member had passed away in the year previous, and they were having a moment of silent reflection for them, which is different than starting the meeting with a moment of silence. There's different ways of doing moments of silence. And so one of those examples is, and I'll find my notes on this one because it's kind of interesting, where, you say, hey, let's take a moment of silence to get our head in the game before we start the meeting. And anyone, that could mean anything to anyone, right? So a religious person might take that minute to pray. Someone who's about to give a speech might take that minute to psych themselves up, to get their head in the game. You might check your phone. You could play some Candy Crush. You could sit there and stare off blankly into space. It's not purposive. It's not a moment of silence that is just prescriptive. And so that to me seems reasonable. We don't have to do that, but the Quebec legislature, l'Assemblée nationale in Quebec starts with a moment of silence. Then they get to work. But the moment of silence isn't telling people what to do. However, what we saw in a couple municipalities in Ontario was the moment of silence was what we called, basically prescriptive moments of silence. So it wasn't like take a minute of silence to reflect on the meeting. It was let's take a minute of silence of silent prayer. Or the one example that we found was let's take a minute of silent reflection on the opening lines of the Canadian Charter. This is in Russell, Ontario. Now, they say let's take a moment of silence to reflect on the opening lines of the Charter.
Please.
Well, the opening lines of the Canadian Charter are whereas Canada is founded on the principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. Now, that might sound great, but at the same time, you're kind of smuggling God and religion in there in a very kind of sneaky way. And so to us, that seemed like a way of trying to sneak prayer into the meeting when Saguenay says you can't have prayer. There was another kind of way of smuggling prayer in. There's the sort of stealth prayer. And that was kind of the example I already gave in the town of Colwood, where they had a school choir come in and sing Deo Gratias, which is, again, like part of the Catholic Eucharistic liturgy. And so that doesn't seem like an acceptable way of, celebrating music in the community is great. We had 3 municipalities that had a poet come give an inspirational poem. But like having a religious poem or a religious song seems like a way of circumventing Saguenay. And that's a problem that we've sort of highlighted. And you can see municipalities surreptitiously trying to engage in legislative prayer. And that's what we call stealth prayer.
It's very clear if you're saying in Jesus' name or the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, or you bring up God, then okay, that's clear. You talked a little bit about how that can be, Mr. Eckelitz reflect on the first line of the Charter, which mentions God, but that's kind of indirect. There's another edge case, and that's, I think it's quite murky when we start talking about the First Nations of Canada. And because I would say that it's fair to say that many of them have what can be fairly described as a religion, but but the structure of it and the nature of it is quite different than the the Abrahamic faith or even Hinduism or Sikh, like what we are quite familiar with. And it's kind of a blurred line, it's very blurry. It's not crisp and clear what is cultural, what is traditional, what is ceremonial, and what is religious. And because of our horrific history as a nation and our treatment of indigenous peoples, there was a lot of enforced proselytization and conversion, and so a non-trivial number of Aboriginal peoples are themselves now Christian, whether through choice or through indoctrination. So how do you determine whether a welcome ceremony, and in the various forms, constitutes a cultural tradition, which is would be fine based on what I've heard you say so far, versus religion, which would not be fine, but showing respect for the original dwellers of the land? And those are it's a challenging. It's challenging to navigate that in a fair and even-handed and reasonable manner without giving someone a free pass. And can you talk about how you address that in your research?
We've been chewing around the outside of this issue for years. My colleague Ian and I published an article called Decolonizing Prayer that starts to explore some of the nuance around this. We are in no means finished this conversation. It's still a live conversation. So first, I would say that Saguenay overtly dealt with religious prayer in municipal council meetings. And when we're looking at indigenous content, there's a myriad, as you've already mentioned, of different types of content that we've seen. So just to sort of back up one step, when we were looking at British Columbia, 2018, we had 114 out of 162 municipalities. Sorry, 2022, we had 114 out of 162 municipalities that had some kind of indigenous content in their inaugural meetings. This is a trend that we're tracking over time that's been...
Right, and that's a lot more than you found in 2018?
Yes, yeah, the numbers are increasing. We're going back to check our numbers in 2018 because we didn't collect that data initially. So now we're going backwards to see what the numbers were in 2018. And in our forthcoming report, we'll have an analysis of that. What I very much suspect has happened, though, is that the numbers increased. And that's a very promising trend, right? We live in an era of reconciliation, and it's critical that we take it very seriously. And part of that is respecting the territories and the traditions of the people whose lands that we occupy. But also on top of that, it's a complex space to navigate, as you point out. And so, for example, what we saw in looking at inaugural meetings, and our research team has looked at more inaugural meetings than I'm sure anyone else has looked at in the country, what we saw was a myriad of different practices. songs, we had drumming, we had dancing, we had speeches. There were traditional welcomes, there were prayers, invocations, there were statements. There was a wide range of Indigenous content, and we are currently working on a typology to try and sort of classify that. Now, some of it is overtly secular, and it's a tradition. So as you mentioned, like traditional, we have territorial acknowledgements here in British Columbia that people use a lot. I know it's a practice that's been spreading across the country. Depending on where people are listening, they may find that practice is more common than not. But we typically will start formal meetings in British Columbia with a territorial acknowledgement, recognizing the traditional territories that we're occupying, and they'll often have a lengthier statement around how we relate to our local Indigenous community. And that's a great thing. It's part of reconciliation. Inviting local elders or local members of the Indigenous community to do a traditional welcome is also really important. And traditional welcomes are really complicated insofar as they are protocol-laden ceremonies. So there's spiritual language, there may be spiritual practices, but they're also political, they're also cultural and diplomatic in nature. So if you look at like what a traditional welcome is, it is often really hard to classify it as an overtly religious practice, even if it has religious language in it. And there's another layer that adds complication, which is syncretism. What we had was an attempted genocide of Indigenous people in Canada, and a lot of that was linked to and connected with religious schools and religion. And as a result, you get a syncretic religion where there's Indigenous practices that may be merged with religious practices from the Christian faith principally. And as a result, you have, for example, here in Saguenay in 2018, a representative of the Indigenous community. We had 2 Christian prayers, and then we had a representative of the Indigenous community give a statement in Wasonic. I don't speak Wasonic, but I did hear Hashka Jesus mentioned 3 times. So there's that aspect. But there's another aspect, which is in light of truth and reconciliation, we want to invite people to these meetings to share their culture and to as part of that reconciliation process. And it would seem deeply problematic to then tell them what to do. Like we're talking about decolonizing our practices. Hey, come share your culture with us. Please come and give a traditional welcome or a traditional statement, but this and this and that. Like that seems deeply problematic. So we enter into this space that we're trying to navigate. And it's one where I don't think we have a definitive answer. Saguenay is very clear on prayer. There are questions and quite open questions. And there was a case in Port Alberni recently that raises the question as to whether you can even call a lot of Indigenous practices strictly religious. There's because they're so laden with culture and with diplomacy and with political content. So it's kind of this live debate, and it's one that we're currently exploring. But what we found was that when a municipality asks someone from the local Indigenous community to come, what they ask them to come do has an impact on what that person then delivers. This seems obvious, but it comes down to the idea of if someone invites you to give a blessing, you will shape what you're delivering into the form of a blessing. And if someone comes and asks you to give a traditional welcome, you will shape what you came to deliver as a traditional welcome. And if someone just says, hey, come do whatever you want, you will probably maybe better express yourself, or you'll probably express yourself how you'd like to express yourself. We know this is the case. We haven't done this quantitatively, but this is more of a qualitative analysis. We know this is the case because, for example, in the town of Mission, we had Jason Thompson, who was a local Indigenous person who was invited to come share content with the municipality. And he was asked to come give a prayer. And he starts his conversation with, our way of prayer is simply good thoughts and feelings. So then he sang 2 songs and drummed, because prayer was kind of not really something, he was trying to fit a prayer. He was trying to fit his own content into the prayer-shaped box, basically. We found this in the BC legislature. When we looked at prayer in the BC legislature, prior to a few years ago, they would ask people to deliver a prayer. And what we found, which was particularly interesting, was 91.9% of prayers adopted a prayer structure. I'm using air quotes here, which means they ended in amen. And that included prayers that we coded as secular. So someone comes, they give a secular statement. It doesn't have anything to do with religion at all, but they end with amen because they've been asked to deliver a prayer. That's
interesting. Yeah.
People, you're trying to be respectful. If someone asks you to give a blessing, you give a blessing. If your blessing is done differently, then so be it. But you get some interesting edge cases as well. So in Squamish, Alan Henry, he was invited to give a blessing from the Squamish Nation. He showed up wearing a lovely vest covered in crosses. And he's like, look, I was just ordained as a Shaker minister. I'm going to pray the way I pray, which is the Shaker way. And that, so you're inviting local representatives of the Squamish Nation, and he used some local content from the Squamish culture, but he also used Shaker content. So you get these interesting layers of complexity around the issue. It's a live issue, and it's one that I'm glad that we're having, because it means that reconciliation is important and that we're treating it important. But it's also really complex, and it's one that we're trying to explore in a wide range of ways.
You've published a lot of research, and I'll put some links in the show notes to what's already published. But what's next for yourself and the British Columbia Humanist Association?
So we have a wide range of research. I'll talk first about our work on legislative prayer. The work's not done. So as I mentioned a few times, we're currently working on updating our BC study. So we're just finalizing the data and the report on prayer in BC municipal council meetings. That should be coming out in November. And the idea there is to spotlight the work that we've done, moving from 25 to around 9 municipalities with prayer, and to highlight the need that the work that needs to be done. We'll be following that up with advocacy and I think quite firmly worded letters from our some legal friends to those municipalities that continue to violate Saguenay. We have an amazing research team of volunteers that have been going over all the municipal council meetings in Ontario, looking at their meetings to update our recent report on Ontario. And then we also have all the data from other provinces. So I have an amazing volunteer who's currently looking at Alberta. We have to publish an Alberta report. Our original vision was to look at compliance with Saguenay across the country. Alberta, Saskatchewan are outliers, the Maritimes. The Yukon and the North-West Territories and Nunavut were a little bit harder to find data, so that one might just be a blog post. We'll see how the data goes. The idea was to understand what are the compliance levels with Saguenay so that we can better we can better ensure that it's followed. But we do other work as well. So we've got a host of other projects, and I'm sure I won't do them justice in mentioning them all. But some of those projects include work on reproductive justice. So in addition to working with the BC Humanists, I'm also the chair of Access BC. We're the campaign that advocated for free prescription contraception here in British Columbia. And we won. We got free contraception here in BC. If people are listening from other provinces, they should check out their local campaign or set one up, because there's a growing movement for this. But this has involved me in a lot of research around reproductive justice. And the BC Humanists and humanists across Canada have a proud tradition of fighting for reproductive justice, given our the previous work with Morgenthaler being one of the early humanist founders, and also fighting for access to abortion in Canada. So we've been working with the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada to look at crisis pregnancy centers. These are clinics that people set up to try to lie, dissuade, manipulate, and deceive people into not choosing an abortion. And we published a report earlier this year with the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada, looking at the websites and deceptive and misinformation on the websites of crisis pregnancy centers. And we have a forthcoming report taking a deep dive into crisis pregnancy centers here in British Columbia. And the idea is looking at how they get funding, their locations, how they try to manipulate people and to deceive them. And sometimes it's a lie of omission, sometimes it's deception, but we have a report coming out on that very soon, which I'm quite excited about, because it's ideally going to really help people not be deceived, and to also avoid federal and provincial and municipal money going to funding these organizations. We're currently working on a lot of work around schools, so religious content in schools. I know this is on a lot of people's minds these days with some of the horrific content we've seen from sort of the far-right bigoted movement across Canada. So we're looking at that. We've been looking at tax policy for many years, tax exemptions that places of worship receive automatically or with the consent of municipalities. And then we have a host of other things that sort of just come up. We have a book project that we've been working on for a few years, looking at secular politics in Canada, which is an edited volume that I'm working on with one of our amazing practicum students to try to assemble. And we've been working on a wide range of things that also include things like secular marriage ceremonies, and we have some amazing people across the country that have been working on secular chaplains, which is something we've been supporting. And then, a wide range of other things that sort of come up, whether it's medical assistance in dying, whether it's access to abortion, whether it's sex education in schools. We're there. We're always sort of at the forefront. And the approach that we take is doing like high quality academic research, and then using that to fuel advocacy and activism that helps ideally make the world a better place, support the separation of religion and government, and support the state neutrality on issues relating to religion.
So I know just how much work goes into creating these original research reports, and the legwork that you and your team have done at the BCHA to create these reports and to give us the data so that we know what compliance is like with the Saguenay ruling. I want to thank you, Teale, for your work and for what you've done, and to the BCHA in general. If you are a resident of British Columbia, please, I'll put the link to the site in the show notes. Go to the site, join the organization. They're doing great work. So Teale Phelps Bondaroff, thank you so much for being a guest today on Podcast for Inquiry. Any last thoughts, any last words for our audience?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. It was a pleasure. And yeah, folks should take a deep dive into our work. One of the great pleasures that we have of not, necessarily always doing purely peer-reviewed academic content is we can take our time. So our Ontario report is over 100 pages. Our report in the BC legislature is over 100 pages. So if you want to take a deep dive, please do. And we are mostly volunteer fueled. So our research team is people with a bit of spare time who don't mind transcribing prayers or municipal websites, and it is amazing what we can accomplish. When we looked at prayer in the BC legislature, we had 871 prayers that had to be transcribed, coded, analyzed, and then and written up. And we had a team of over 50 volunteers that stepped up to help with that. So this is really, it's public participation in what I think is really important research. And I will also note that the work that we're doing around legislative prayer has a spillover effect, right? We talk about the impact of religion on people's day-to-day lives, and the government putting its finger on the scales in some situations. Legislative prayer is symbolic, but it also underscores a deeper issue, which is the need to support the separation of religion and government, and the need to make sure that our states are neutral. And that's an important step that we're looking at all different levels. So yeah, people, please do check out our research. We have, I think, the most extensive collection of publications relating to legislative prayer, but we do a lot of other work as well. And yeah, thanks for giving me a chance to talk about my work, and always a pleasure.
That's great. And maybe when you publish the follow up, we might have you on again to talk about the changes between 2014, 2018 after the Saguenay ruling, and 2022 when there's more awareness, thanks in no small part to your efforts. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Links for today's discussion can be found in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please show your support at patreon.com/podcastforinquiry and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Email us podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We are a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web and Facebook and Twitter at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Lee Shields, Zach Dumont, and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood. See you next time.